Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to JSCM Impact Conversations. I'm so thrilled to be here because today's episode, we'll talk about something really important and yet somehow like underexplored. So we are going to talk about supply chain emissions, but we will talk about methane, and we are going to have a very brilliant and quite important voice in this debate. And I'm so happy to be joined by Emma Hakansson. Emma, hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
We are so pleased to have you here. So thank you so much for joining us. And this is Journey of Supply Chain Management, and our audience is policymakers and mostly academics. And I wanted to bring your voice and your work to this audience to start with our conversation. Can you explain who you are and what you do in your daily operational activities and beyond?
Yes, so I'm Emma Hakansson. I am the founding director of a charity that's called Collective Fashion Justice. We exist to create what we call a total ethics fashion system. So, one where consistently people, our fellow animals, and the planet are all considered ahead of profit, not choosing one or some of those groups, but realizing the importance of viewing them as interconnected and holistic. We produce new research, which we'll be talking about. We also work on creative projects to inspire the fashion industry to care about that new research and some of the progress that needs to be made. We focus a lot on shifting materials, particularly around animal-derived and fossil fuel-based materials, to more responsible bio-based solutions. We do policy consultation, material sourcing strategy assessments with brands. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about what we do.
No, this is great, Emma. Thank you so much. Also, I will leave the link in the chat box, in the description box, especially about Collective Fashion Justice. It is a great organization, and I invite everyone to take a look and to also join forces because we are in this together. Yeah, so let's start our conversation. And I'm so curious to ask you. So, methane is a very important source of actually the global emissions. And when we think of the fashion industry, the vast majority of carbon footprint and literally the environmental impact is coming from all lower tiers and supply chains. So
Mm,
supply chain emissions is an important unit to analyze. So in your experiences, you are focusing on methane in an
mm,
industry which is literally creating lots of products
mm.
across multiple tiers and multiple supply chains. But in these conversations, in the context of climate change, we are not focusing on methane. I want to ask you, why is this important and why is this fundamental for us to reframe the conversations around decarbonization?
Mm. So I think to start with, if we're talking about methane, it's really important that people understand why it matters. A lot of the time, particularly in fashion, if we're talking about greenhouse gases, we're normally talking about carbon equivalent emissions, and we sort of just neutralize everything into this one measurement, which is important and has value, but it can flatten our understanding of how different greenhouse gases function very differently in the atmosphere. And so methane is about 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term, which is obviously a problem. That means more global warming. But it also comes with an inbuilt slice of hope, is how I like to think of it, because it doesn't last nearly as long in the atmosphere as compared to carbon dioxide. We're talking like a couple decades as compared to hundreds, if not over thousands of years for carbon dioxide. And so that means really potent now, doesn't last as long. Methane is the kind of emergency brake on climate crisis. And given where we are in the climate crisis, we need solutions that quickly reduce global temperatures. And that is what methane mitigation can do. The fashion industry in particular, but all industries really, are only just at the beginning of grappling with methane. We just saw at COP30, it's increasingly a big part of the discussion. The UK is developing its own methane national action plan, but there are no brands at the moment in fashion that are specifically outlining and sharing what their methane emissions are beyond within carbon equivalent emissions or setting mitigation paths. We need to change that though, because if we look at something like the Global Methane Pledge, which over 150 countries have signed on to, we need to reduce methane by 30% by 2030 as compared to a 2020 baseline. So we are halfway through that timeline, which means we have a lot of work to do. And the fashion industry doesn't even really know how to start from that 2020 baseline, because until now, when we've developed with Cornell and New York University this first estimate methane footprint for the fashion industry, there was no baseline. So actually all of the data that comes in our methane report, we can assume we have to do even more than that, because we have to go further back 5 years where production volumes were a little lower than they are now.
Absolutely, no, great points. Thank you so much, Emma. Also, the big thank you to the Cornell University and all the scholars and our friends at Cornell. And also, Jason Judd will be in this season of Impact Conversations. So we have so much to also discuss with him. But you raised a very important point and question mark. So the fashion industry, but also many industries, they still don't understand the fundamental difference between mitigation and adaptation. And we
Mm,
always try to come up with incremental solutions, but especially to frame supply chain emissions, we have to be quite serious also about the long-term transitions to adaptation. So, and
mm,
we cannot do this without involving people, without working with them, and without creating long-term transition plans, which is literally bringing us to the concept of just transition. But now I have a question to be a little bit provoking, Emma. I know you are very open-minded and quite
Please provoke me.
ex. No, but no, with you, I want to provoke the fashion industry because
Mhm,
as you know, the fashion industry and some other quite influential and rich industries, they are so good at hijacking policy and
mm,
creating, in a way, quite polarized conversations to justify inaction, to hijack conversations so then they can legitimize the current business model. This happens within so many different conversations, and I don't want this to happen in the context of methane. So I want to ask one question. So in the report and everything that we are discussing, we are actually paying attention to methane, but it is mostly coming from animal
mm,
based products. So you are so right. We should be more bio oriented, so biomaterials, biodegradability, etc. But I'm a little bit concerned because I don't want this to become a greenwashing mechanism for the fashion industry to further promote synthetics and
yeah.
polyester. And also, if you look at the LCA structures, oftentimes LCAs are quite context specific, and yet the results are overgeneralized, and the
Mm.
industry gets away with the impact that they generate. So I would just want to be a little bit provoking. How can we prevent this from happening? How can we make sure people understand the right thing?
I think the first thing, I mean, in terms of greenwashing and lobbying by industry implicating the discussion of methane, it's certainly already happening. So we can talk about that more. But I think to start with, we just have to consistently refuse the false binary that we either have to choose an animal or a fossil fuel-based material. It's unhelpful. And that is something that our charity is constantly dealing with, that there's this assumption that you mean one or the other when it's both untrue and unimaginative, and we can and should expect better. Just to give a bit of context on the research, so the methane footprinting, what we found when we were looking from cradle to grave, and we assumed that everything was landfilled just based on the realities of what's happening in fashion at the moment. Most of it is. And we found that despite animal-derived materials from ruminants, so, animals that graze and have multiple stomachs, those materials make up about 4% of volume of material, but cashmere, wool, and cow skin leather made up about 75% of methane emissions, so hugely disproportionate. And then the second largest source, around 20% of the rest of the emissions, was the continued reliance on non-renewable energy, specifically coal and gas, throughout other parts of the supply chain. And so then, that's another reason where we see that fossil fuel production, whether it's for synthetics or for energy, also has huge methane consequences. So we just try to consistently remind that we aren't advocating for one or the other. But it is tricky because, of course, there are alternative materials that are made in that space. And I think the problem can go both ways as well. If you look at the lobbying from the oil industry, it's very clear what they're doing, but equally, The leather industry, we have a whole report that is about the disinformation that they push, and the wool industry as well. They have tried to push something called GWP star, which is a different kind of calculation as compared to GWP 20 or 100 that really is designed to make methane emissions from animal agriculture seem much less significant. There's all kinds of things happening in that space as well. A lot of the push actually in fashion at the moment around regenerative agriculture, which obviously has some really significant biodiversity benefits, is also, however, being used with a form of climate disinformation, where there's this argument that so long as it's a biogenic form of methane, it's essentially fine, which is not true. They function almost exactly the same in the atmosphere. And we know that even if we have rotational grazing of cows or sheep, that can help to sequester and securely store carbon in the soil. But what do we do once that soil is full of carbon and can't take in anymore, and we're just left with more methane emissions from the animals? This is one of the spaces where I'm really concerned about disinformation and distraction, where we do need to reduce and massively reduce our reliance on both those ruminant animal-derived materials and, of course, on the fossil fuel materials, where we just transition to a totally new supply chain.
Absolutely, this is great. Also, Emma, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this frank conversation with you, because especially those that don't know of you, you always actually frame the conversation around holistic action and plurality. And also, you said something really important. We are not talking about an either-or situation. We
Mm,
are not creating polarized views. And
mm,
also, in one of our upcoming research papers, we are looking into queer theory just to
mhm.
explain how binary thinking is something that we should really
Unhelpful.
challenge. It is not helping anyone. So non-binary thinking, so plural views is are fundamental. And also everyone should take a look at collective fashion justice, because also you frame everything around decolonization perspective to make conversations more plural and holistic. So we thank you for this. But some takeaways from for all of us: supply chain emissions must be literally reframed, and methane is a very important source. Misinformation and disinformation are already happening. If you look at the COP30 in today's context, we are having a really important questions to raise and
Mm,
important messages to give to be more provoking. But this brings me to the the I think the elephant in the room is, of course, overproduction, but also the governance problem. Fashion industry is so old-fashioned, and the structures are so ill-designed, and thinking is so old. It is binary-based, but also leadership styles are so old. How can also we challenge this as researchers? It is a good question to join forces, to keep working together, because I think this silo thinking and top-down supply chain culture is not helpful. We just need to find a way to create more holistic and inclusive change to create a supply chain culture around ethics, so then we can actually create something good for everyone, not just for a bunch of rich companies.
mm, totally. And I think that, there is this very extractive model where in most fashion supply chains, the business that ends up selling the final product gains most benefit, most profit, and the further away you get, the less benefit you get. And part of that is, I think, which would be a big shift, but having a shift where there's a more genuine collective kind of ownership of production and of profit and more sharing between stages of supply chain. But also, I think we have to acknowledge that, we're at a point in fashion supply chain management where if we use animal-derived materials, just as an example, since we're already speaking about that, we're not even at the stage of full transparency, particularly with a material like leather. So many brands cannot get beyond the slaughterhouse level. If they find the farm where a cow is being raised, it may only be one, because there's often a feedlot, a farm before that, and there's potentially even a birthing farm separate. And so we don't even know what happened to that animal in their life. And we certainly don't know even anything about the people that were involved in that. And that's really important, because if you look to somewhere like Brazil, where we just had COP, and which is about the third largest producer of skins, about 60% of their kind of list of companies associated with forced labor are tied to cattle ranching specifically. So we have huge problems there. But transparency alone, I don't think will change this. You know, there's a lot that has to be done to understand problems, but some issues can't just be solved because the exploitation is inherent. And so I'm really interested in looking at, as we were talking about, just transition opportunities to supply chains where we can have a much more radically different kind of idea. And so for me, that starts to be thinking about what would farmers potentially like to do instead. There's an assumption that everyone wants to do the same thing, but actually there's a lot of surveys that are being done now across a whole different parts of the world that says a lot of farmers are highly committed to staying on their land and trying to look after the land. They're aware that sometimes what they're doing at the moment is not aligned with that, and they'd like help to move into alternative production, even if that means moving beyond animal production. And so then you can look into what would that be instead. For example, there was a parliamentary inquiry in Australia, and we did kind of multi-zone mapping of where is there wool production, where is that impacting land degradation, where is it also suitable for increased hemp production, which would also help with some of the climate goals of the state that we're talking to. And I think that becomes a much more difficult conversation because there's also this extractive view means there's a danger that as we try to change materials, which we should, that we would continue the problem of just telling people further down the supply chain what to do, or losing things that we don't want to lose. So another example, whenever I speak to Italian fashion brands, there's a massive fear of using like next gen leather, bio-based materials because they don't want to upset the culture and the value and significance from a heritage perspective of tanneries. And that's a very legitimate concern. But mycelium, Polybion's celium, which is made from fruit waste turned into a cellulose-based leather alternative, all of these can be produced in tanneries if those tanneries have support to develop slightly different but still very much the same infrastructure. And I'm really interested in looking in those spaces where we can have heritage and innovation come together. So we're not just like leaving people behind, we are justly transitioning and taking the good and leaving the bad. That was a bit of a, I went everywhere, but
No, fantastic. And this is really spot on because also this is a quite future-facing research question. We have to embrace innovation in specific areas such as luxury production, where craftsmanship and heritage are the fundamental, literally essential, the DNA of those companies. Is a very important question. And supply chain people, we are giving you so many questions. Please get in touch with Emma, get in touch with us. We are talking about power, trust, relations, governance, just transition, and we cannot do this alone. We have to do this with all the research participants, but also with other external stakeholders. So this is just a joint conversation, and I invite everyone to join forces. So Emma, thank you so much for your vision, for your work. Collective Fashion Justice and Emma Hakansson is going to be with us, and information will be shared, and they are doing some fantastic work. So it is our task to also support you and bring some different perspectives from the scientific point of view. Emma, whenever you need something, reach out to us, and the same for the supply chain people. So the future is unwritten. We just have to make sure it is going to be ethical and just for everyone. Emma, before we go, would you like to share something, final takeaways, reflections? What would you like to say?
yes, I think, on just that end note of ethical and just, I would really encourage people to remember that it's so easy when we're talking about supply chains to fall into a more sterile view where it's just the maths and the science and the governance. But if we forget that we as people are just animals, one of many wonderful species, and all of us as animals are actually a part of nature rather than living in it, it's much easier for us to continue with the norm because we are less connected to what we face in terms of loss. And so when we talk about justice, just transition, we should consider that from not just an ecological perspective, but a multi-species perspective. It's not just about justice for us.
Thank you so much. This is a great point. And just as a final remark, Ashish Kotari is a dear friend, and he is a very important post-growth philosopher. And he was also in this season a couple of weeks ago. He has a book with many other post-growth scholars, and they say something really important. If you think of this, ecology and economy, they share the same Greek origin, which means home. But the thing is, as humankind, we think we are the superior and we have the power, and we think all resources are at our disposal and we can do
Overtaking.
everything. We take everything for granted. This is the mindset shift that we have to provoke, and this is a culture that we should change. Emma, thank you so much for being with us, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. And I see you soon. And all the everyone listening to us, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you at the next episode, and please get in touch with Emma and have a great time. See you later.
Thank you.